The smell of fresh bread filled the tiny galley as Tommy Reeves pulled the last batch from the oven. Steam rose from the golden loaves, and for a moment he could almost forget they were floating in the cold darkness between stars. The cargo ship. Starfall had been his home for 15 years, and this cramped kitchen was his kingdom. Tommy wiped flour from his hands with a worn towel and checked the time. The crew would be hungry soon after their long shift loading supplies at Europa Station. He had learned every person's favorite meal during his years aboard the ship. Rodriguez loved his grandmother's tamale recipe, even though Tommy had to make it with synthetic corn. Williams always asked for extra pepper on everything. Young Pete from engineering had a sweet tooth that could never be satisfied, the knife in. Tommy's hand moved with practiced ease as he sliced vegetables for the evening stew. The blade had belonged to his grandfather, then his father, and now him. The steel was old but sharp, worn smooth by decades of use. Some of the newer crew members laughed at his ancient tools when molecular food printers could make anything in minutes. But Tommy knew that real cooking required more than just pressing buttons. A sudden jolt ran through the ship, making the pots rattle on their hooks. Tommy frowned and steadied himself against the counter. That had not felt like a normal course. Correction. The intercom crackled to life with Rodriguez's voice, tight with worry. All hands to emergency stations. We have unknown vessels approaching. Tommy's heart began to race. Pirates were common in this sector, but the Starfall carried nothing valuable except basic supplies and equipment. He moved to the small porthole in his galley and pressed his face against the cold glass. In the distance, he could see shapes moving against the stars. They were huge, much larger than any human ship he had ever seen. The shapes grew closer, and Tommy's breath caught in his throat. The vessels looked like they were made of crystal, their surfaces reflecting starlight in rainbow patterns. They moved with a grace that seemed impossible for something so massive. These were not human ships. The hegemony had found them. Tommy had heard the stories from other traders and cargo haulers. The crystalline beings had appeared 5 years ago, claiming vast territories on the edge of human space. They were tall, powerful, and viewed humans as nothing more than primitive animals suitable only for basic labor. Colony after colony had fallen under their control, and those who resisted simply disappeared. The ship shuddered again as tractor beams locked onto the hull. Through the porthole, Tommy watched as the crystal ships pulled the Starfall into what looked like a massive docking bay. The walls around them glowed with soft blue light, and he could see tall figures moving in the shadows. "This is Captain Rodriguez," the intercom announced. "All crew members will remain calm and follow orders. Do not resist. I repeat, do not resist." Tommy slipped his grandfather's knife into his belt and covered it with his apron. Something told him he might need it later. The galley door hissed open, and 2 hegemony soldiers entered. They stood nearly 10 feet tall, their bodies made of what looked like living crystal. Their faces had no expression Tommy could read, but their voices sounded like glass grinding against stone. "Food preparer," one of them said, pointing at Tommy with a finger that gleamed like a sword blade. "You will come." Tommy followed them through corridors that seemed to pulse with their own light. Other crew members were being herded into holding cells, their faces pale with fear. Rodriguez caught Tommy's eye and nodded slightly as if to say everything would be okay. But Tommy could see the captain was just as scared as everyone else. The soldiers led him to a vast chamber filled with strange equipment. The walls were covered in panels that shifted and changed colors, and the air hummed with energy. In the center of the room stood a being that was clearly in command. It was taller than the others, its crystalline form more complex and beautiful. When it spoke, its voice resonated through Tommy's bones. "I am High Processor Thelver," it announced. "You will prepare nutrition solutions for this vessel's crew. Your primitive cooking methods will be adapted to our needs." Tommy swallowed hard and found his voice. "What about my crew? What about my friends?" Thelver's form shifted slightly, and Tommy thought he saw amusement in the creature's alien features. "They will be processed according to their usefulness. Some may serve as manual laborers if they prove worthy. Others will be disposed of. The casual way the hegemony leader spoke of his friends' lives made Tommy's hand move instinctively, too. His knife. Thelver noticed the gesture and made a sound that might have been laughter. You carry a primitive blade, food preparer, how quaint. Do you believe such an ancient tool could threaten us? Tommy forced his hand away from the knife and tried to keep his voice steady. It's just for cooking, sir. I've used it my whole life. Indeed, Thelver said. You will find that your new duties require different tools. But perhaps we will allow you to keep your quaint relic as a reminder of your primitive origins. The soldiers escorted Tommy to what would be his new workplace. It was nothing like his cozy galley aboard the Starfall. The room was sterile and white, filled with machines he did not recognize. There were no ovens, no stoves, no familiar tools. Everything was controlled by panels of blinking lights and strange symbols. A smaller hegemony being approached him, its form less complex than the others. I am Nutritional Overseer Dalman, it said. You will learn to operate this equipment to produce adequate sustenance for the crew. Failure will result in your termination. Tommy spent the next several hours learning how to use the alien food systems. They were incredibly advanced, able to create any molecule or compound with perfect precision. But they lacked something essential that Tommy could not quite name. The food they produced was technically perfect, but somehow empty, like eating. Colored air got as he worked. Tommy's mind raced. He was alive because they needed someone to prepare their food. That meant he had access to something vital to their survival. His grandfather had always said that a good cook needed to understand not just recipes, but the people he fed. Their likes, their dislikes, their needs. Maybe it was time to learn about hegemony dietary requirements. That night, as Tommy lay on the small cot they had provided, he clutched his grandfather's knife and thought about his friends locked in those holding cells. Rodriguez had always said that every problem had a solution if you looked at it the right way. Tommy had spent his whole life solving the problem of feeding people with limited resources and basic tools. Perhaps feeding the enemy would prove to be his greatest challenge yet. The knife felt warm in his hand, and Tommy made a silent promise to his grandfather's memory. This blade had fed his family for generations. Now, it might be time to teach it a different kind of cutting. 3 months of preparing nutrient solutions had taught Tommy more about his captors than they realized. Every morning, he watched Dalman consume the same precise mixture of minerals and proteins. Every afternoon, he observed how different crew members required different chemical balances based on their crystal formations. The hegemony were creatures of perfect routine, and Tommy was learning to read their patterns like a recipe. The food preparation bay had become his world. The sterile white walls reflected the blue glow of the processing machines, and Tommy had memorized every sound they made. He knew when the protein synthesizers were running low, when the mineral extractors needed maintenance, and exactly how long each solution took to reach the proper consistency. But what the hegemony did not know was that Tommy had also been studying them. Each member of the crew had different dietary needs based on their crystalline structure. The warriors with darker crystal formations required more iron compounds. The technical staff with clearer bodies needed different trace elements. And High Processor Thelver, with his complex prismatic form, consumed solutions that were far more sophisticated than the others. Tommy had been making small changes. Nothing dangerous, just tiny adjustments to see how they would react. A slightly different mineral balance here, a trace element removed there. He told himself he was just learning, but deep down he knew he was planning something larger. The intercom crackled with an announcement that made Tommy's blood run cold. All human prisoners were to report to the central processing chamber for evaluation. Tommy watched through the small window of his workspace as his former crewmates were led past in shackles. Rodriguez walked with his head high, trying to project confidence, but Tommy could see the fear in his old friend's eyes. Tommy tried to continue his work, but his hands shook as he measured out compounds. The machines around him hummed with their usual efficiency, but everything felt different now. Through the walls, he could hear voices speaking in the grinding language of the hegemony. Then came a sound he would never forget, a high-pitched Whine followed by absolute silence. Dalman entered the food preparation bay shortly after, his crystalline form shimmering with what Tommy had learned to recognize as satisfaction. "The evaluation is complete," he announced. "Several of your species proved unsuitable for labor duties." Tommy's voice came out as barely a whisper. "What happened to them?" "They were processed for disposal," Dalman replied casually, as if discussing the weather. "Their molecular structure has been recycled into useful materials. Waste not, want not, as your primitive saying goes." Tommy's grip tightened on the mixing rod in his hand. Rodriguez had been his friend for 8 years. They had shared countless meals together, talked about their families back on Earth, planned what they would do when they retired from space hauling. Now he was gone, erased as if he had never existed. "The remaining humans will continue in service," Dalman continued. "But their rations will be reduced as punishment for the insubordination displayed by their leader. You will prepare minimal sustenance for them going forward." After Dalman left, Tommy stood alone in the sterile chamber, surrounded by machines that could create any substance imaginable. His grandfather's knife hung heavy at his side, hidden beneath his work apron. For the first time since his capture, he pulled it out and looked at its worn surface. The steel was old but sharp, marked with tiny scratches from decades of use. His grandmother used to say that a good cook could read people through their eating habits. The way someone held their fork, what they chose to eat first, how they reacted to different flavors. It all told a story about who they were inside. Tommy had been reading the Hegemony crew for months, and he was beginning to understand their story. They were creatures of precision and routine, but that precision was also their weakness. They trusted their systems completely, never questioning whether their food might be anything other than what it appeared to be. They saw Tommy as nothing more than a primitive tool, useful only for operating equipment they considered beneath their attention. That night, Tommy began his real work. He started with small changes to Thelver's personal nutrition solution. Nothing that would cause immediate harm, just minor adjustments to the mineral balance that might cause mild discomfort. The high processor had murdered his friend with casual indifference, and Tommy wanted him to feel something other than complete control. The next morning, Thelver complained of digestive irregularities. Tommy suggested that perhaps the ship's atmosphere was being contaminated by the presence of inferior human biology. The high processor immediately ordered the remaining prisoners' air rations reduced and their holding cells cleaned with harsh chemicals, but Tommy was learning something important about his enemies. They were not just physically different from humans, they thought differently too. Their minds worked like their machines, following logical patterns and established procedures. They could not imagine that a primitive food preparer might be capable of deception or sabotage. Over the following weeks, Tommy began to map out the entire crew's dietary requirements. He learned which minerals affected their neural functions, which proteins influenced their energy levels, and which trace elements were essential for their crystalline structures to remain stable. Every day brought new knowledge, and every meal became an opportunity to gather intelligence. The other human prisoners were suffering under their reduced rations, but Tommy found ways to help them. He discovered that certain nutritional compounds meant for the Hegemony crew could be safely consumed by humans in small amounts. Food scraps and preparation waste could be smuggled to the holding cells when the guards were not watching. More importantly, Tommy began to understand the ship itself. The food preparation systems were connected to other networks throughout the vessel. Environmental controls, waste processing, even some security functions could be accessed through the same terminals he used daily. The Hegemony's love of efficiency meant that every system was integrated with every other system. One evening, as Tommy prepared the night shift solutions, he made a discovery that changed everything. The atmospheric processors that controlled the ship's air supply were directly linked to the food preparation systems. In theory, anything that could be created in his laboratory could be introduced into the ship's atmosphere. Tommy stared at the terminal screen, watching data flow between different ship systems. His grandfather's voice seemed to whisper in his memory, "A good cook knows that timing is everything." Too early and the meal is ruined. Too late and the moment is lost. Tommy had spent 3 months learning his enemy's weaknesses, gathering intelligence, and preparing for an opportunity he was not sure would ever come. But now, standing in the sterile food preparation bay with his ancestor's knife at his side, he realized that the opportunity had been there all along. He was not just a cook anymore. He was a man with access to everything the hegemony needed to survive, and they had given him the tools to turn their own biology against them. The only question was whether he had the courage to use what he had learned. Tommy looked at his reflection in the polished surface of a processing machine. The face staring back at him was harder than it had been 3 months ago, marked by loss and anger and a growing understanding of what needed to be done. His grandfather's knife felt different in his hand now, not just a tool for preparing food, but an instrument of justice. The time for small adjustments and minor sabotage was ending. Soon it would be time for the blade to find its true purpose. 6 months had passed since Tommy first entered the crystalline halls of the hegemony vessel, and he had become something he never expected to be: a student of war. Not the kind fought with guns and explosions, but the subtle art of defeating an enemy from within. Every meal he prepared was now a calculated move in a game his captors did not even know they were playing. The morning shift change brought familiar faces to the food preparation bay. Tommy watched as the bridge crew collected their individual nutrition solutions, each one carefully crafted to meet their specific biological needs. What they did not know was that each solution now contained Tommy's own special additions. Nothing immediately harmful, but compounds that would build up slowly in their systems over time. Navigation Officer Kethmal had been consuming solutions with slightly elevated copper levels for 2 weeks now. The excess metal was beginning to interfere with his neural pathways, causing minor calculation errors that forced the ship to adjust course repeatedly. Engineering Supervisor Vertan was experiencing similar issues with her spatial reasoning, thanks to the careful depletion of certain trace minerals in her daily nutrition. Tommy had learned that hegemony physiology was remarkably precise, but also fragile. Their crystalline bodies required exact chemical balances to function properly. Too much of one element or too little of another could cause cascading failures throughout their systems. And the beauty of his method was its invisibility. The effects appeared to be natural degradation or equipment malfunction. The food preparation bay's main terminal chimed softly, indicating that it was time to begin preparations for the evening cycle. Tommy pulled up the atmospheric processing interface, something he now accessed daily under the pretense of ensuring proper air quality for food preparation. The hegemony's obsession with system integration meant that almost every function on the ship could be controlled from his workstation through the atmospheric processors. Tommy had been introducing trace amounts of airborne compounds that affected hegemony cognitive function. Nothing dangerous enough to cause immediate alarm, but sufficient to create confusion and reduce reaction times. The guards who once moved with perfect coordination now occasionally bumped into walls or forgot their patrol routes. A soft knock on the bay door interrupted his thoughts. One of the human prisoners stood in the doorway, flanked by a drowsy-looking guard. It was Williams, the former engineer from the Starfall, and he looked thinner than Tommy remembered. The reduced rations were taking their toll on the surviving crew members. "Food preparer," the guard said in his grinding voice. "This human unit claims to have technical knowledge that might be useful for maintaining your equipment." Tommy nodded carefully. "Yes, Williams knows about molecular processors. He might be able to help with calibration issues." The guard hesitated, clearly struggling with a decision that should have been simple. Tommy's atmospheric modifications were working better than he had hoped. After several long seconds, the guard waved Williams into the bay and took up position outside the door. Williams approached Tommy's workstation, pretending to examine the equipment while speaking in a whisper. "The other prisoners are getting sick. Peterson died yesterday and Martinez can barely stand." Tommy's hands continued working on the evening preparations, but his voice was tight with anger. "I'm doing what I can. There are nutritional supplements in the waste recycling system. Check compartment 7 after the night shift change." "Tommy," Williams said quietly, Some of the crew are talking about trying to fight back. They think we should rush the guards when they bring the next meal. No, Tommy said firmly. But that would be suicide. They would kill everyone immediately. Williams was quiet for a moment, watching Tommy work with practiced efficiency. Then what do? We can't just wait here to die. Tommy glanced toward the door where the guard was leaning. Against the wall, his crystalline form slightly unfocused. We wait, and we trust that sometimes the most effective weapon is one the enemy never sees coming. After Williams was escorted back to the holding area, Tommy returned to his real work. He pulled up the ship's complete biological database, something he had gained access to weeks ago by convincing Dalman that he needed to understand crew dietary requirements in detail. The information contained in those files was staggering. Every member of the Hegemony crew had a complete biological profile, including detailed breakdowns of their cellular structure, metabolic processes, and chemical dependencies. Tommy had memorized dozens of these profiles, learning exactly which substances each individual needed to survive and which ones would cause them harm. The database also contained information about Hegemony reproduction cycles, healing processes, and communication methods. Tommy discovered that their mental coordination depended on shared chemical signals transmitted through their crystalline nervous systems. Disrupting these signals would be like jamming a radio frequency, causing confusion and disorientation. Throughout the entire crew, Tommy began work on his most ambitious project yet. Using the atmospheric processing system, he started introducing compounds that would interfere with Hegemony neural communication. The process would take weeks to reach effective concentrations, but the results would be worth the wait. When the time came for action, his enemies would be isolated from each other. Unable to coordinate their defenses, the days blended together as Tommy refined his methods. He learned to read the subtle signs of his work's effectiveness in the behavior of his captors, guards who forgot their posts, officers who issued contradictory orders, technical staff who made basic errors in routine maintenance, high processor. Thelver had begun showing signs of the neural disruption as well. During his daily inspection of the food preparation bay, he moved more slowly and seemed to have difficulty focusing on Tommy's reports. The compound cocktail Tommy had been feeding him for months was finally reaching critical levels. Food preparer? Thelver said during one such inspection, his voice lacking its usual authority. The crew efficiency ratings have been declining. Do you know why this might be occurring? Tommy kept his expression neutral while his heart raced with excitement. Perhaps the extended space travel is causing fatigue, high processor. I could adjust the nutritional solutions to include more energy-boosting compounds. Yes, Thelver agreed, swaying slightly as he spoke. Implement these changes immediately. Tommy bowed respectfully and waited for the high processor to leave before allowing himself a small smile. Thelver had just given him permission to introduce even more disruptive compounds into the crew's food supply. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. That evening, as Tommy prepared the final nutritional solutions of his shift, he reflected on how much had changed since his capture. 6 months ago, he had been a simple cook whose greatest concern was whether the crew would enjoy their dinner. Now he was orchestrating the systematic weakening of an entire enemy crew using nothing but his knowledge of chemistry and biology. His grandfather's knife hung at his side, still hidden beneath his work apron. Soon he knew it would be time to use it for something other than food preparation. But first he needed to ensure that when that moment came, his enemies would be too confused and weakened to mount an effective resistance. Tommy looked through the small window of his workspace at the corridor beyond. Hegemony soldiers walked their patrols with less precision than before, their movements slightly unsteady. Officers stumbled over routine communications. The entire ship felt different, as if a subtle poison was working its way through every system. In many ways, that was exactly what was happening. Tommy had become the poison, spreading through his enemies' bodies one meal at a time, preparing them for the moment when his grandfather's blade would finally taste crystalline blood. The art of war, Tommy had learned, was not always about loud battles and dramatic victories. Sometimes it was about patience, precision, and the quiet satisfaction of watching your enemies destroy themselves from within. The night cycle alarm echoed through the ship's corridors as Tommy made his final preparations. 8 months of patient work had led to this moment, and every detail had been planned with the precision of a master chef preparing his greatest meal. The atmospheric processors hummed quietly as they distributed his chemical masterpiece throughout the vessel, carrying compounds that would soon turn the hegemony's own biology against them. Tommy stood in the food preparation bay, surrounded by the machines that had become his weapons of war. The terminals displayed normal operational status, but he knew that within hours the carefully balanced toxins now flowing through the ship's air supply would reach critical concentrations. The hegemony crew would find their reactions slowed, their coordination disrupted, and their famous precision reduced to clumsy confusion. His grandfather's knife felt different in his hand as he drew it from beneath his apron. The worn steel blade caught the blue light of the processing equipment, and Tommy could almost hear his ancestor's voice whispering encouragement. This weapon had fed 3 generations of his family, but tonight it would feast on something entirely different. The holding cells where his fellow humans were imprisoned lay 3 levels down from the food preparation bay. Tommy had memorized every corridor, every guard station, and every security checkpoint between his current position and his friends. More importantly, he knew exactly when the guards would be most affected by the airborne compounds he had been spreading for weeks. A soft chime indicated that the night cycle had officially begun. Throughout the ship, hegemony crew members would be entering their regenerative meditation, a deep trance-like state that allowed their crystalline bodies to absorb energy and repair cellular damage. During this time, only a skeleton crew remained active to monitor essential systems. Tommy began moving through the corridors with practiced stealth. The first guard he encountered was swaying slightly at his post, his crystalline form flickering as neural disruption interfered with his body's natural energy flow. The hegemony soldier noticed Tommy approaching but seemed unable to process the threat until it was too late. The knife slid between crystal plates with surgical precision, finding the neural cluster Tommy had identified through months of studying. Hegemony anatomy. The guard collapsed without a sound, his form going dark as his life force dissipated. Tommy felt a moment of grim satisfaction. This was for Rodriguez, for Peterson, for all the friends who had been murdered by these crystalline monsters. The corridor ahead was empty, but Tommy could hear the soft humming that indicated hegemony crew members in meditation. He moved quickly, but carefully, using service passages and maintenance shafts to avoid the main patrol routes. Every few minutes he encountered another guard, each one more disoriented than the last as his chemical cocktail reached full effectiveness. The second guard actually tried to sound an alarm, but his movements were sluggish and uncoordinated. Tommy's blade found its mark before the crystalline being could complete the gesture. The third guard never even noticed Tommy's approach, too focused on trying to maintain his balance as neural disruption sent conflicting signals throughout his body. By the time Tommy reached the detention level, he had eliminated 6 guards without raising a general alarm. The hegemony's famous efficiency was working against them now, as their rigid protocols assumed that missing guards were simply delayed by routine duties. No one expected a primitive human food preparer to be hunting their warriors through the ship's corridors. The detention center's main door required a security code that Tommy had observed weeks ago during a prisoner transfer. His fingers moved across the crystalline interface, entering the sequence he had memorized. The door slid open with a soft whisper, revealing the corridor that led to his friend's cells. Williams was the first to see him approach, and the former engineer's eyes went wide with shock. "Tommy, how did you get down here?" "Keep your voice down," Tommy whispered as he began working on the cell's locking mechanism. "We don't have much time before they realize what's happening." The other surviving crew members gathered around as Tommy freed them one by one. There were only 12 left from the original 30-person crew of the Starfall, and they all looked thin and weak from months of inadequate rations. But there was something else in their eyes now. Hope. "What's the plan?" Williams asked as he help support Martinez, who could barely stand. "We take the ship," Tommy replied, distributing makeshift weapons he had crafted from kitchen utensils and maintenance tools. "The crew is compromised by chemical agents I've been introducing into their systems for months. They're confused, disoriented, and operating at reduced capacity." One of the younger crew members, a communications specialist named Foster, stared at Tommy with new respect. "You've been poisoning them?" "I've been preparing them," Tommy corrected. "The same way I would prepare any other meal, with patience, attention to detail, and the proper ingredients." The group moved through the ship's corridors like ghosts, encountering minimal resistance as Tommy's months of preparation paid off. Guards stumbled past without noticing them, too affected by neural disruption to maintain proper awareness. Officers issued contradictory orders to subordinates who were too confused to follow them correctly. The bridge was their ultimate objective, but Tommy knew they would have to fight for it. High Processor Thelver would be there with his elite guard, and despite the chemical handicaps, they would still be formidable opponents. Tommy had saved his strongest toxins for this final confrontation, compounds that would not take full effect until the humans were ready to make their assault. As they approached the bridge level, Tommy felt the weight of his grandfather's knife in his hand. The blade was stained now with the strange, luminescent fluid that served as hegemony blood. It had tasted alien flesh and found it wanting. Hungry for more of the creatures who had murdered his friends and enslaved his people, the bridge doors stood before them, sealed and guarded by two elite warriors whose crystalline forms still showed signs of strength despite Tommy's chemical warfare. These were the High Processor's personal guard, selected for their resistance to outside influences and their absolute loyalty. They would not fall as easily as the others. "Food preparer," one of them said as Tommy approached, his voice still, carrying traces of mechanical authority despite the neural disruption. "You are not authorized to be in this area." "I know," Tommy replied, raising his knife so that the alien light reflected off its blood-stained surface. "But I'm here anyway." The first guard moved with surprising speed despite his compromised state, crystal blades extending from his arms as he lunged toward Tommy. But months of watching hegemony combat techniques had taught Tommy their patterns and weaknesses. He rolled aside and came up behind the warrior, his knife finding the gap between armor plates with deadly accuracy. The second guard lasted longer, but the chemical agents in his system made his movements predictable. Tommy danced around his attacks, using superior agility and knowledge of hegemony anatomy to stay ahead of the crystal blades. When the opening finally came, his grandfather's knife struck with the same precision that had once carved holiday roasts for family dinners. The bridge doors opened to reveal High Processor Thelver standing alone at the command station. His prismatic form was flickering erratically as the concentrated toxins Tommy had been feeding him for months finally reached critical levels. But there was still dangerous intelligence in his alien features, and his voice retained its grinding authority. "So, the primitive food preparer reveals his true nature," Thelver said, crystal weapons extending from his arms. "Did you truly believe your crude chemical warfare could defeat the hegemony?" Tommy stepped onto the bridge, his knife held ready as he faced the being who had murdered his captain and enslaved his crew. "I learned something during my time in your kitchen, High Processor. The most dangerous ingredient in any recipe is the one you don't know is there." The final battle began with Thelver moving faster than Tommy had expected, his remaining strength focused into a desperate assault. But the High Processor's coordination was fatally compromised, and his attacks lacked their usual precision. Tommy fought with the skill of a man who had spent months studying his enemy's every weakness, his blade finding its mark again and again until the mighty hegemony leader finally fell. As Thelver's crystalline form went dark and cracked apart, Tommy stood victorious on the bridge of the ship that had been his prison. Behind him, his fellow humans worked to secure the vessel and free any remaining prisoners. The impossible had happened. A cook with a kitchen knife had defeated the most advanced military force in the galaxy. Tommy looked down at his grandfather's blade, now stained with the blood of those who had thought themselves superior to humanity. The knife had fulfilled its purpose, proving that even the most humble tools could become instruments of liberation when wielded by someone who understood their true potential. 2 years had passed since the liberation of the hegemony vessel, and Tommy Reeves found himself in a position he had never wanted or expected. The small resistance base hidden in the asteroid belt of the Kepler system buzzed with activity as fighters from across human space gathered to hear reports from their cells. What had started as one cook's desperate act of revenge had grown into something much larger. The conference room was crowded with faces Tommy barely recognized, men and women who had taken his methods and adapted them to their own situations. Maria Santos had been a janitor on a hegemony mining station before she learned to introduce industrial solvents into their air recycling systems. David Park had worked as a maintenance technician, using his access to sabotage critical equipment at precisely the right moments. They called themselves the Kitchen, and their numbers grew daily. Tommy sat at the head of the table, uncomfortable with the leadership role that had been thrust upon him. The others looked to him for guidance, expecting tactical brilliance from a man who still thought of himself as nothing more than a cook with a sharp knife. His grandfather's blade hung on the wall behind him, displayed in a place of honor that felt strange and wrong. The Centauri operation was a complete success, reported Alex Chun, a former food service worker who had infiltrated a hegemony command station. We eliminated their entire senior staff during the night cycle. The station is now under human control. Similar reports came from around the galaxy. Supply depots poisoned by their own cooks. Military vessels crippled by maintenance workers who knew exactly which systems to sabotage. Administrative centers brought down by janitors who had learned to turn cleaning chemicals into weapons of war. The hegemony's own efficiency was destroying them as their human servants revealed themselves to be anything but harmless. But Tommy felt no satisfaction in these victories. Every success meant more people looking to him for answers he did not have. Every liberated station meant more responsibility for decisions that affected thousands of lives. He had become a symbol of human resistance, but symbols were not supposed to feel tired and overwhelmed. What about the Titan sector? Tommy asked, trying to focus on the tactical situation rather than his own doubts. Williams, his old crewmate, from the Starfall, pulled up a holographic display showing hegemony positions throughout human space. 3 major installations remain under their control, but our people are in position. The cooks at the mining complex have been working for months to weaken their guards. The maintenance staff at the shipyard have identified critical structural points. We could launch coordinated strikes within the week. Tommy studied the display, seeing not just military targets but the faces of the people who would die when those strikes began. Human servants who had found the courage to fight back, but also hegemony crew members who were just following orders from their superiors. War always demanded a price in blood, but Tommy had hoped there might be another way. There's something else, Williams continued, his voice carrying a note of concern. We've been monitoring hegemony communications, and they're starting to adapt. Some of their installations have replaced human workers with automated systems. Others have begun testing their food and air supplies for contamination. The room fell, quiet as the implications sank in. The Kitchen's greatest advantage had always been invisibility. The fact that their enemies saw them as harmless servants rather than dangerous opponents. If the hegemony was learning to defend against their methods, the war would become much more difficult. We need to hit them hard and fast, suggested Martinez, one of the freed prisoners from the original Starfall crew, before they can fully adapt to our tactics. That would mean open warfare, Tommy replied, his voice heavy with the weight of command. More people would die, both human and hegemony. There has to be a better solution. The debate continued for hours, with voices raised. In argument over strategy and tactics, some wanted immediate action, others counseled patience. Tommy listened to it all while staring at his grandfather's knife, remembering simpler times when his greatest worry was whether the crew would enjoy their evening meal. Finally, Foster from Communications brought news that changed everything. I've been monitoring deep space transmissions, she announced, her face pale with excitement. The Hegemony Home Fleet is requesting emergency reinforcements from their outer territories. They're pulling back from dozens of systems. The room erupted in celebration, but Tommy felt only a hollow emptiness. Victory was within reach, but at what cost? How many friends had died in holding cells while he learned to poison their captors? How many servants had been executed when their sabotage was discovered? The liberation of humanity was being written in the blood of ordinary people who had found extraordinary courage. Over the following months, the hegemony's grip on human space continued to weaken. Supply lines collapsed as their own workers turned against them. Military installations fell silent as maintenance staff introduced critical failures into life support systems. Administrative centers ground to a halt as their computer operators began subtle acts of data sabotage that would take years to fully repair. Tommy found himself traveling from system to system, not as a military commander, but as something stranger. A teacher of war through cooking, a professor of rebellion disguised as food service. He showed captured servants how to read their captors' biological needs, how to introduce toxins that would build up slowly over time, how to turn the hegemony's own efficiency against them. But with each lesson, he felt a piece of his soul slip away. The knife at his side had become a symbol of hope for millions of humans. But Tommy remembered when it had been nothing more than a tool for feeding people he cared about. The weight of other people's expectations was crushing him, turning a simple cook into something he did not recognize. The final blow came when Tommy visited the liberated mining complex in the Ross system. The human workers there had followed his methods perfectly, introducing atmospheric toxins that weakened the hegemony guards before launching their uprising. The facility was now under human control, but the cost had been terrible. Tommy walked through corridors stained with crystalline blood, past the bodies of hegemony soldiers who had died confused and afraid, their neural systems disrupted by chemicals they never saw coming. These beings had been warriors, but they had also been individuals with their own hopes and fears. The toxins had stripped away their dignity along with their lives. "You did this," Tommy whispered to his reflection in a broken crystal panel. "You taught us how to kill them without giving them a chance to fight back." The return journey to the asteroid base was quiet, with Tommy lost in thoughts that grew darker with each passing hour. When they finally arrived, he found a crowd of new recruits waiting for him, eager faces full of hope and determination. They wanted him to teach them the secrets of invisible warfare, to show them how kitchen knives could become instruments of liberation. Instead, Tommy walked past them all and entered his private quarters. The small room was Spartan, containing only a bed, a desk, and the wall where his grandfather's knife hung in its place of honor. He stared at the blade for a long time, remembering the day his grandfather had first placed it in his young hands. "A good cook feeds people," the old man had said. "He brings them together, makes them happy, helps them feel at home no matter where they are. That's the real purpose of this knife." Tommy reached up and took the blade down from the wall. The steel was clean now, polished until it gleamed, but he could still see the stains that soap and water could never wash away. This weapon had tasted alien blood and human tears, had carved a path through an empire built on crystalline arrogance and casual cruelty. But it had also forgotten how to slice vegetables for a simple stew, how to carve meat for a family dinner, how to create meals that brought people together instead of tearing them apart. The knife had won a war, but in doing so it had lost its soul. A soft knock interrupted Tommy's thoughts. Williams entered the room, his face creased with concern for his old friend. "The new recruits are asking when you'll begin their training," he said quietly. Tommy looked down at the knife in his hands, feeling its familiar weight and balance. "Tell them to go home," he said finally. "Tell them to find their families, rebuild their communities, and remember what we were fighting for in the first place." "Tommy, you can't quit now," Williams protested. "There are still hegemony strongholds throughout the galaxy. The war isn't over." "It is for me," Tommy replied, sliding the blade into a simple leather sheath. "I became what I needed to become, to save our people. But I won't become a monster just because the uniform fits." 6 months later, Tommy Reeves opened a small restaurant on New Terra, one of the first worlds to be fully liberated from hegemony control. The establishment was nothing fancy, just a few tables and a kitchen where he could practice the art he had almost forgotten. Above the stove, he hung his grandfather's knife in a simple wooden frame. Visitors often recognized him and asked about the war, expecting tales of glorious battles and tactical brilliance. Tommy would smile and redirect their attention to the menu, suggesting dishes that might remind them of home. He had discovered that feeding people properly was much more difficult than poisoning them, but infinitely more rewarding. The inscription beneath his grandfather's knife told the whole story in just a few words. He was just a cook until the knife became a weapon of war. But Tommy had added his own line below it. Then he remembered that weapons can become tools again, if you have the courage to set them down. The galaxy was still healing from the wounds of war, and there were still hegemony remnants hiding in distant systems. But Tommy Reeves had found his way back to who he had always been, a man who understood that the greatest victories were not won with knives and poison, but with simple meals shared among friends who had survived to see another day.